Welcome to another episode of Radical Grace in the Economy. This is based on a workbook that's online at radicalgrace.ca, and I will give you some references on screen to exactly where that can be found. Where we are discussing, let me just read from the preamble of it, a workshop on how mainstream economics makes fundamental value judgments which violate key spiritual values. It addresses 9 areas where the foundations of economics rest on assertions which are not acceptable to people of the Spirit. And it discusses how applying deeper values drawn from the insights of Franciscan and Indigenous economics can move us towards an economy of spirit. So I'm Gary Russell, the author of the workbook and the initiator of this podcast, although I'm not the most important person here. I'm a fellow Franciscan. We're all 3 Franciscans, Anglican Franciscans. I've had a long teaching career in which I taught economics, and I have since renounced economics, trying to initiate a different approach toward economic principles. Jody, who are you?
I really wonder sometimes who I am. My name is Jody Knoll, and friend of Gary's. I'm a parish priest, and again, a member of the Third Order of the Society of St. Francis. And happy to be here. I know nothing about the economy, but I know that I live using economic principles, and I'm here to learn and discuss and be enlightened.
Well, I used to teach it, and I'm here to learn. Would you like to introduce our guest?
Absolutely. We're delighted this afternoon to have Jeff Golliher joining us. Jeff is he's a cultural anthropologist, read, written, and well published, and we're delighted to have him here this afternoon. He's a parish priest. He's a Third Order Franciscan. He's actually the assisting minister for sacred ecology in the province of the Americas. So Jeff comes to us this afternoon as a researcher, an author, and an authority on really creation and the spiritual and discussion of creation. This afternoon, although Gary gave a lovely introduction for his workbook, we're going to be discussing a publication that Jeff took part in. It's a book called Partnership as Mission, Essays in Memory of Ellie Johnson, which was edited by Kenneth Gray and Maylene Mabey. It's a Canadian publication, and Jeff is one of several contributors to the book. His contribution in particular, chapter 18, is entitled The Mission and Hope of Eco-Justice. That's an interesting title, Jeff, The Mission and Hope of Eco-Justice, a Franciscan Perspective. So Jeff is here this afternoon to talk and chat about that as it relates directly and indirectly to Gary's overall piece on radical grace in the economy. Anyway, welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me. And this, given the times in which we live and the circumstances of all our lives today, this is a critical topic for discussion, no doubt about it. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Now, I want to lead off with a note of appreciation. I have thought myself to be a leading light in the Franciscan approach to the environment because I've been telling people, don't just talk about saving ourselves from self-imposed destruction. Maybe we deserve it anyway because of the way we've treated the earth. We as Christians especially should be talking about being stewards of God's creation, nurturing God's creation, loving God's creation. And people generally respond pretty positively to that, and I can get them on board with that idea. But Jeff, in this article, helped me a great deal in consolidating in my mind that there's another step further than that. We not only should be nurturing God's creation, we should be coming to realize that we are one with creation, that we're not just separate bodies being good to creation. But as the Indigenous people, when they say all my relations, they're not only talking about family and community, they're talking about Mother Earth. And one of my favorite expressions is, the land is family. Am I describing your approach there, Jeff?
Yes, you are. And I think that you just put your finger on probably the key issue too. So thank you for saying that. But I think that our public discussions about the crisis that we're facing too have been are multi-layered and complicated in part because we're trying to get the public's attention in about this, and that's part of it. But that's only part. Is that once then we get people's attention that in fact we have a crisis that we must respond to. Once that happens, then we begin to also talk about what it is really that we need to do and what's going on and where we're headed and it's like we're learning how to live all over again and having to face the facts that we had been, the way that we had been living and thinking about it for centuries in the West has been destroying our life together with Mother Earth. It's a lot to ask humanity to think about, but the fact is that for the most part, humanity has understood this for several billion years. And it's in relatively recent times in human history that we've forgotten some very basic things. And so it's like relearning, covering, remembering, but on a deep level, like what you're saying.
Jeff, you mentioned the Earth Summit back in 1992, which is about 32 years ago now. And you said that from the Earth Summit, there was a hope. And the hope, this is in your article, the hope was and is that sustainable development, guided by human rights and the elimination of poverty, could be accomplished in an ecologically sound way. Do we still believe that?
Yes. What has happened in the last 30 years since then has been that there's been a lot of resistance to pursuing that hope because of the power of profit. And this is where Gary's comments on economics and his concern about the primary nature of economics, economic practice, and so on. And that's a large part of the problem. The profit over a life together, profit rather than a life together. Profit at the expense of a life together. By life together, I'm talking about the whole fabric of life, which is our existence. And in a manner of speaking, a kind of battle has been taking place since the Earth Summit. All the nations of the world, for the most part, agree to the principles of the Earth Summit. There have been major UN meetings, global meetings, summits, almost every year since then. People know the climate summits, the COP summits, but there have also been summits on population, on gender, food, water, energy, biodiversity, all aspects of it. And in every case, some of the major economic powers in the world are resisting that for the sake of profit. And I don't think the public is aware of how brutal that process has been. Now, 32 years later, the stakes are getting higher and higher because we don't have time to wait anymore or to debate about this. We have to move ahead and do the right thing for the sake of the whole planet, not just for the sake of the United States or me, right? Or the whatever. So that's where we are. And yes, that still is the hope and the goal, because that must be the goal if we're going to both survive on the one hand and have a livable planet on the other.
No, I'm always interested in the question of how do we get from here to there? And I'm always very strategic in my thinking. And you mentioned profit and some of the subtext of that. When you say profit, you're talking about profit for me. You're talking about the ultra-individualism of our culture. And it is perfectly legitimate for me to seek profit for myself. And then we hire economists to say, well, profit for yourself is going to benefit everyone. And that's where I, as an economist, come in and say, no, that story is a crock. Profit for everyone just produces predatory capitalism, not competitive capitalism.
I think it's a piece to get people to see themselves as part of the fabric of creation. That's a piece of work. And Jeff's writing has attempted to do that we don't see creation as something apart from ourselves, that we see it as part of ourselves and we a part of it. direct connection. And your reference to Thomas Merton, you already saw Thomas Merton as a prophet ahead of his time, didn't you?
Yes, yeah, I did.
Oh, yeah.
I also grew up in that way. So when I was a young boy, it was when he was becoming more well known. So I grew up on Thomas Merton. So he is a prophet in my life, but at the same time, I think he has been in the history of the church too.
Yeah, I'm a big follower of Thomas Merton. I'm currently reading his New Seeds of Contemplation.
Merton made the comment that you referenced it in your article, that Merton made the comment that the greatest need of our time is to clean out the enormous mass of mental and emotional rubbish that clutters our minds and indirectly affects our political and social life.
That's right. That's right. About that, it's interesting because when I know even as a young person some years ago in discovering Thomas Merton, and before I knew about the consequences and so on of all this, I think I was understanding something that was true about Merton that needs to be emphasized today, and it's not just about him. What I'm getting at is that what Merton was saying about cleaning out the mental rubbish in our minds is that really he's talking about the very basic teachings of Christian faith and how to live as a Christian in practice. It's not something, I mean, it may sound radical or whatever, but has been the foundation of the teachings all along. It's not new, and it never was. And I think a whole lot of what we need to be doing today is like that. It may sound radical to a lot of people. I don't know. But basically, we're talking about following in the path of Jesus and Francis and Claire, but actually taking it really seriously. Life depends on it, because it actually does. I think it always has. Jesus knew that. Francis knew that. It's not just ideas, or there's a kind of needed discernment that's going on that needs to happen here too about what's really important in life. And for all of us, for everybody, to learn how to think and discern and know what really matters and what doesn't. And we're living at a time, especially now, I think, maybe also social media, all of our world culture has so quickly in the last 40 years for technical reasons that we might need to really emphasize on how to be a person again. What does it really mean to be a person? And I don't mean as in the individualistic way, other than community, but what is a human being?
Here I would want to turn to Thomas Merton again, because he made the distinction between the false self and the true self. And the false self is just me trying to be me all by myself without God. And the true self is living on a walk with God and living through God. So then the question that gets raised strategically is, well, we have almost everybody in society seems intent on living their full self. How do we get them to recognize what their true self is, that they really are part of God's creation through and through? And if they're trying compulsively to be individuals and only individuals, they're missing life.
You make a reference that Francis discovered that to be humanly human, which I think is a really interesting word, on page 207 of your article. Francis discovered to be humanly human is to enter into relationships of kinship with the whole fabric of life. His conversion exemplifies what we call decolonization. So are you saying we really need to search for another kind of sense of authentic humanity? We need to redefine what it means to be human?
Definitely, yes, and especially within Western culture. I think I'm saying this based on my experience as an anthropologist too, where I spent a lot of my life with indigenous peoples, Central America, South America, try and learn, exploring what that challenge that you described, what's that like? And what I did learn was that Western culture is we see ourselves as special or set above, and religion can encourage that. But we don't primarily see ourselves as part of and in a relationship of brother, sister, sibling, commonality with the world, including other peoples and other cultures. And there's a lot of penitence that needs to happen in Western culture about that. But religion has encouraged that through the generations too, where even the origins of Christianity institutionally, like from the beginning with Constantine in the Roman Empire and so on, is that we were taught that the foundation of the teachings was in relation to the empire somehow. But no, in the sense that what was being said is that our identity as human beings and our souls, you might say, that's separate from, you don't have to be part of the Roman Empire or the American Empire or European Empire to discover who you are as a person. An indigenous person in the Amazon, and they have a very different story, which is, in my opinion, more truthful about this.
No, that brings me to one of the words when Jody was quoting from your article. There was also the word decolonize.
Yeah.
How do you relate that to colonization?
So that's a really touchy word these days. And it's become a very kind of politicized kind of word too in the current political year, at least in the United States and so on. And it's a lot of negativity goes with it, as if, and I don't get into the politics of this on that level. Real politics, yes, not in this more name-calling kind of way that's going on. But what has happened over the last several centuries is that a person is enculturated or raised as a member of a culture, a member of family, community, nation, culture as a whole, to internalize the values of what amounts to something that justifies exploitation and a kind of domination. And without realizing that, just think about the children being raised. They don't understand what's really happening. And the guardians, as it were, of our culture, don't want us to realize that there is a big problem here in doing that, an ethical, moral, deeply spiritual issue. And that is something I think that the Western culture is beginning to we're knocking at that door in a good way, saying we need to open that door of reflection and discernment. And a lot of powers and principalities and powers do not want that door to be opened. But we have to knock on that door and open the door. I remember I'll give a story. When I was 9 years old, I remember sitting in a small, very rural church, a very poor part of the country in the U.S. where I was raised, and hearing a kind of sermon that was, in a way, very traditional, but at the same time, it was not. It was a kind of American, in a negative kind of way, sermon where what was being said is that we, whoever we is, we are better people than those across the road or across the river or across the world, and that we're special and they're not, and that God is on our side and not theirs, and that's the reason to have faith. And I remember as a 9-year-old rejecting that, and I went home and talked to my mom about it, and I got depressed, and I withdrew not depressed really, I withdrew within myself for about a week. And what had happened in part was I was raised with two very kind parents. The way I was taught around the table was always tell the truth and never say bad things about other people, and that sort of gossipy thing. Don't do that. So then I go to church and hear exactly what it is that I was being taught not to think or do. And in a certain sense, I think a lot of children have that same kind of perceptual sensitivity, like I did when I was 9. My mom called an older, wise minister that lived not far away, and she trusted and asked him to come talk to me. We got in his car one day. We drove to a secluded, nice place, and he stopped the car and said, "Jeff, what's going on? Your mom's." And I told him, I said, Preacher Morris was his name. I said, Preacher Morris, I told him what I heard in the church. And I said, I do not believe that God is like that and that life is like that. And he looked at me and he said, Jeff, he said, I think you're right. Always think for yourself and make up your own mind. And that set me on a kind of path that, this was not a radical man, Preacher Morris. This was just a faithful person. And when I hear today the fearful criticism about more efforts to decolonize our culture and how awful it is, I remember Preacher Morris. And I'm saying, no, you're wrong. Preacher Morris was right. Think for yourself, make up your own mind, use your discernment, look at the bigger picture. See, do we know where we live? What do we see? Who are our neighbors after all? It's not the people on my side of the river, but not those on the other side. We're all neighbors. That story from my childhood was very pivotal in my life.
Francis had the same experience, Jeff. Francis, in your article you wrote, his conversion of life, which is what you had. You were experiencing this conversion of life at the time. And for Francis, 850 years ago, to unwrap himself from his middle-class life, physically, for everyone to see, he went into the town square, took off all his clothes, gave his father back his clothes, and said, I will no longer call you my father. And not only in not calling him his father, but he had a big conversion of life. And that was an outward as well as an inward experience, which seems to be what you're describing in your story.
Yeah, it was. That's I think you're right.
I look at colonization, I'll take the North American context. It wasn't just a land grab, although that was bad enough. Colonization was the invading culture saying, this is the only way to live. These are the only things to believe. And it's the way of living that was imposed upon the colonized is exactly the one we're saying that we have to oppose in order to save the planet. It is the growth imperative. It is the consumption culture where we're supposed to try to consume as much as we possibly can according to economics. And so I want to get back to that strategic question. We have a population that has been thoroughly indoctrinated that life is about getting what you can get. And there's only one way to live, and that is as a satisfied consumer. That's the only legitimate lifestyle. And we have people who have been raised in this generation after generation, and we're trying to completely turn that around. And the Franciscan lifestyle includes the rule of self-denial, to live with less and find the joy in living with less. That is so far removed from the consumer culture that we have nowadays, which is grab. Is it even remotely possible to turn that around and get people to think in terms of living with nature, living with Mother Earth, living in moderation, the way that we see that people have to live? Is that doable?
I've thought about that for years, and my understanding of it as it relates to what I'm doing in my life is that it won't happen overnight. It's going to take a while. But one of the reasons I became a Franciscan was because of this question. And the answer, my understanding of it is that the heart and core of the Franciscan vision is to follow that path. That is that path that we're talking about. And even though most of a whole lot of humanity would not be willing to walk it right now with us, even in their own way. I'm talking about people I'm talking about people of all faiths joining together in our common humanity for the sake of our life together. But I think Francis and Claire right now want us to be Franciscan in that way and to live it, and show as much leadership as we can, and teach the next generation of Franciscans to be Franciscan in that way too, recognizing that the change is not going to happen overnight. But we have to maintain our faith and hope for the sake of in the long term. For the present, yes, but I think of it that way. That's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. I do think Franciscan key role to play in the transformation process that is beginning, but it's not happened quick enough now. We don't know what's going to happen in the next generation. The younger generation is showing a lot of good signs about being willing to rethink some things. Not all, but there's a kind of generative openness there. When people sometimes ask me about why kids, at least why do the kids not go to church? Isn't that a bad thing? And what I'm seeing is that the kids are interested actually in some of these deeper spiritual questions, but they're not hearing them addressed in the churches. So it's not that the kids their minds are shut. I think their minds are more open than we realize. But the fact that they don't always do things the way we're doing them now, that could be a pretty good sign. We need to help them learn how to live in the same way that we need to learn how to live.
So that leads into a good point you made in your article where you said how Francis, in his conversion of life, has come to see the whole of God's creation as the church and not just the buildings and institution.
Yeah.
If kids are interested in creation and the spirituality of creation, they're actually interested in the bigger church, aren't they?
They are.
What I've been telling people in my church circles is, like when we're talking about the decline in church attendance and all that, what I've been saying is, you look out in the community, there are a whole lot of people that are doing God's work and don't even know it. And we should be going out and reaching out to those people and not trying to draw them into our churches, but working with them. And one other thing, the indigenous approach, at least in some of the indigenous subcultures, is 7 generations. You work for change 7 generations down the road. Now, I don't know if we've got 7 generations.
There's a sense today in that intelligent people are concerned. Intelligent people are in the know. Can we provide a light for people? Can we provide, as a church, can we provide an answer to their seeking and their searching? And I think that's the church, the institution, has to make some radical choices if they want to be a leading light in this. But I think the world that's educated, the world that's knowledgeable, is aware of that things are not okay. Forest fires rage, floods rage, things are upside down. But I think they're seeking for light somewhere.
I do too. Much more than you would get the impression from listening to the media. And the media is reporting the news reports and so on. It's the news of it in a way, but it's not conveying something about what's at the heart of our lives right now. I think especially with younger people or people of any age, one of the most transformative things that can happen is just to have really honest conversations. Not back and forth. I'm right, you're right. This is what I think. This is what you think. You know what I mean? But more a kind of opening of the soul that is based on listening and sharing and smiles and tears. There's something about that strengthens our capacity to be human, to be deeply human. And the way this might have lived, Francis might have listened to people walking along down the side of the road, just being there. Or in our community, sometimes it's really important to go to the local diner and say hello to people and you know what I'm saying? You do actually mean it.
We have one of our priests in my diocese, Rupert's Land, just outside of Winnipeg, and he goes regularly to the local McDonald's, and he just chats with people, and they know he's a priest, but he doesn't preach at them. And he just gets their opinion and tries just to lead an intelligent conversation about things related to the spirit. And they respond to him partly because he's not pushing his religion on them, but just because he's engaging with them and discovering where they have common ground, where he can say, oh, that bothers me too, and get those conversations going. And so I think a large part of it is getting conversations going, especially with the people that are on the fence, especially, because those are the ones who might move.
So our order of Franciscans functions within the institution of the Episcopal and Anglican Church. But Jeff, you makes it quite clear that we need to unwrap the self-righteous religious identities we have. And when we unwrap that and talk honestly and openly, we're not saying that we do not need some level of administration in the Christian faith to oversee the continuing of the faith, but it's that if it's one based on power and authority, it doesn't work.
That's right.
One of the things I got from Richard Rohr, a well-known American Franciscan, and I don't think he drew the language from Francis, but the way Richard Rohr puts it is, we Franciscans operate on the edge of the inside. We're still inside the church, but we work along the edge where we can still be part of it, but we can also be pushing the boundaries. And I think that's what we're all trying to do in that sense.
I agree very much.
Yeah. Jeff, do you think that the people in the church are ready to ask those three questions? The three questions you alluded to.
Yeah.
Do we really know where we live? What do we see? Who are our neighbors? Do you think we in the church are ready to ask those questions?
I think we might need to till the soil a little bit. We'll definitely want to do that, especially if it's helping people understand that the question is not in the abstract, but we're really talking about where we live, your neighbor, the river down the road, or the cornfield, or the factory. What do we actually know what's happening in our backyards or in our front yards, for that matter? And it be a little bit, not unnerving is too strong of a word, but a little awkward at first for anyone, for all of us, to realize that we don't know nearly as much as we think we know. It's a little startling at first how much we don't know about where we live, but that's okay. But I think people need some encouragement about that. It's like getting to know yourself again. So we're not saying that you're doing something wrong, or a person is doing something wrong. What we're saying is, let's learn to open our eyes and appreciate more where we are and who we are together. So it's asking people to say, you got to be careful about the word penitence, because in our culture, and as part of the decolonizing thing, is to think that penitence is only something that involves a self-deprecating, I'm such a bad person, kind of attitude. That's been discussed many times. Matthew Fox was brilliant about that. But I think, what Gary was saying a few minutes ago about how it is that we relate to each other and how we be the church. And Jody, what you said too about the colonizing nature of our church, it's still there. In other words, if it's about power and authority, then in a way we end up worshiping the church. It's a form of idolatry where we associate the church building with God's house, literally, and that God is there but not outside. And that's actually a deep form of idolatry, like putting Jesus in a box, as it were. Now, that's pretty weird. We have to understand that the church is really the whole creation, in a process of spiritual renewal.
The word parish in the old days, and technically still does, means the neighborhood that the church building is in. And so
Yeah.
it's not a box, it's the whole territory.
It's a living presence. Yeah.
Yeah, living presence.
You also mentioned a quote from Korzybski, "The map is not the territory."
Yep. Korzybski was getting at the same thing. He was a geographer and a philosopher, but he was deeply aware that people, and he was writing also at a time when maps, which was part of the colonization process, to have maps of everywhere in the world. When I was a graduate student early on, I was studying geography, and I had a job in a map library for a geography department. And they're wonderful. I love maps, but the map is an illusion of the mind to think that this document that we have made is more than it is. And that's what Korzybski said. The map is not the reality. Don't forget that. And I've written about this in different other places before. Is if someone asks me where I live, the answer I will routinely give is probably my mailing address, or the place where the post office delivers my mail, which is a little bit like I'm giving an answer based on the map. It's the answer that if a policeman were to pull me over on the side of the road in my car and I would hand him my driver's license, and he would say, "Where do you live?" I'd tell him my address. But that's not where I live. Not in any spiritual, ecological reality is that where I live. It does a word about the fabric of life. And so that's a simple little piece of kind of evidence of what I'm talking about. But that's actually where our minds are. We're not embodied. The incarnation is about the incarnation. And in order to really live out the incarnation of Jesus, we need to put ourselves back in our bodies, but not really present. So we want to have an embodied faith, embodied in our bodies, embodied in the body of life, which is the body of Christ, which is the fabric of life. And so it's like coming back home again. We need to come home and be where we're meant to be, and where God in Eden, where God said, "I want be here. That's what I want you to do. That's your purpose." And our minds are somewhere else.
Jody mentioned one of your three questions was, "Who is my neighbor?" That's the secondary question. The primary question was, Christ said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And then someone asked, "Who is my neighbor?" And love your neighbor as yourself. If I go up to someone and point to them at a bus shelter, and this guy, this derelict living in this bus shelter, is your neighbor, and Christ is saying to love that guy as much as you love yourself, is that going to work? Yeah, we agree that's right. But how many people are you going to convince to love the derelict living in the bus shelter as much as they love themselves? Aren't we really far from that?
Probably, but that doesn't mean that we don't do it anyway, because that's what we're called to do. So I can't not do something as basic as I think it's not going to pan out for me. I don't know. I have to let go of the, as it were, the rewards, and hold on to the calling. And that's what I'm asked to do. That's part of the penitence, I think. I'll be picking up a lot of baggage that I don't need. You know what I mean? I know you know what I mean.
I know what you mean, but I hear, does it pan out for me? I know you're not concerned about whether it pans out for you personally. We're concerned about whether it pans out for that person in the bus shelter, and whether it works on the person we're trying to convince to love his neighbor or love her neighbor. And I think you're right to say, well, yeah, it's a long way down the road before we can ever accomplish anything but we got to start now. And so I agree with that approach you're taking there. Jody, what do you think?
Well, I just want to say that in reading Gary's books on radical grace, and reading Jeff's article on the mission and hope of eco-justice and finding a spiritual groundwork for action, my wife and I just made a decision to use one car. So for 28 years, we've had two cars. We thought we had to have two cars. We needed two cars. It was easy to justify. We could afford two cars. And we were about to lose one. We thought, okay, this needs to be replaced. We looked at the cost. And we thought, do we really need a second car? So not only did we get rid of our second car, but we donated it to a charity and did that. And that brings in the point Jeff made about Francis. You won't find Francis sitting in a library there's no picture of Francis sitting at a library with a pen in his hand. He is out among people. And I think that's an element of Franciscan spirituality that we prize very highly. That is, we have to, if we don't practice what we believe, is not what we say we believe, it's what we practice.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Well, I was just saying recently in a discussion, Christ doesn't really care what I believe. Christ cares about what I do. And if I'm living my life the way Christ says to live my life, because Christ said I should live my life that way, if I got my ideas wrong, that doesn't matter.
I think that's probably right. Yeah. That's probably right.
This has been great. This has been really great to chat with you here this afternoon, I must say. And I really appreciate the opportunity to make some comments about these various topics that are dear to your heart and dear to our heart as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Given Jeff's position with regard to his capacity as the assisting minister for sacred ecology, there is a section in your book as well, Gary, on that, do not of the earth. So maybe a future podcast could look at some of those questions and how because Jeff asks three very powerful questions in his article. Do you know where you live? What do you see? Who is your neighbor? They have economic impact. Fly right in the face of profiteering, of consumerism, of I'm special and you're not. It flies directly in the face of all that.
Okay, Jyoti, how would you like to pray us out?
Okay. Once again, thank you, Jeff. And it's a pleasure, Gary, to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Creator, pour out your spirit upon us and grant us a new vision of your glory, a new experience of your power, a new faithfulness to your word, and a new consecration in your service as we continue to live our lives as part of your unfolding kingdom here on earth and in the life to come. Amen.
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 Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Jeff. To the listeners and watchers of this podcast, that's it for this time. But we don't have a schedule. We just set up our discussions whenever we can. So keep tuning into radicalgrace.ca to see whatever next one comes up. This one will go up online pretty soon. And maybe we can look forward to talking to you again, Jeff. And all right.
I'd love it.
And thank you. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.